The American Catholic Church talks a lot about defending religious liberty, but who gets that protection? Today we're looking at how a principle meant to safeguard the vulnerable is often applied selectively, shielding some while leaving others deeply vulnerable. You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast exploring Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology. I'm Max Kuzma, a transgender man and columnist for the National Catholic Reporter and a board member of Dignity USA. Thank you to the paid Substack subscribers who make this work possible. On February 17th of this year, the American bishops released their annual report on religious liberty. On paper, it's about defending freedom of conscience, but the reality is more complicated and a lot more dangerous. Right now across the country, there are an incredible number of laws that are targeting transgender people, restricting medical care not only for youth as well as now adults, banning participation in sports, again for a very small number of athletes because the trans community is so small, limiting basic rights, such as even having a driver's license, and even more concerning, developments such as experimental conversion therapy being performed on transgender people who are in prison, up to and including removing access to their hormone treatments. Instead of standing with transgender people, along with all the marginalized, the way the church has always been called to do, the Catholic Bishop's Report seems to frame not only legal protections for trans people as a threat to religious liberty, but also trans people ourselves as a threat, not only to society and legal stuff, but just to the world, that trans people are dangerous. So this isn't really about religious liberty. At the end of the day, we know what side Jesus would have been on. He was the poor son of a carpenter, a man with brown skin, a man who was executed by state power, a man who spent his life with the people who were discarded and stigmatized by society. He was always with the vulnerable and the marginalized. He was, quote, a shepherd with the smell of his sheep, which is, what Pope Francis would have said, and what he modeled by meeting with the people on the margins. The stakes here are real. This isn't just about abstract debates or legal theories. These are the lives of real people. Transgender people are parents, siblings, neighbors, co-workers, and members of church communities. They are raising families, showing up for work, volunteering and participating in parish life. Policies that restrict their rights and access to care hurt real people, the communities they belong to, and attack something essential about the fabric of everyday life and our values. In this episode, we're going to unpack what the Bishop's Report actually says, how its framing supports harmful laws, and what it means for transgender people trying to live safely, fully, and with dignity in a country that is increasingly hostile and dangerous to them. I'm going to start with a pretty wide legal view, just outlining some of the things that have been going on in the country more broadly towards transgender people. In 2025, with the second inauguration of Trump, the administration issued the executive order titled Eradicating Anti-Christian Bias, which explicitly targeted what it called gender ideology. By framing transgender people themselves as a political and cultural problem, the order positions an entire community as a target for government action. This is dangerous because it gives cover for policies that strip away rights, deny recognition, and threaten basic protections for transgender people. The administration further fueled this fear by posting an unrelated image of a topless transgender woman from a Pride event in 2023, falsely claiming it was recent. This kind of deliberate misrepresentation spreads misinformation and reinforces stereotypes. The danger is clear. It turns trans existence itself into a perceived societal threat, making it easier for the public and policymakers to justify discriminatory measures. It's a pattern that we've seen. We know that transgender people were used as a topic to divide people and, as a big, scary bad that led to the election of Trump. Over 50 times in the past year alone, Trump has used the phrase, quote, transgender for everybody, which is just absurd on so many levels. But one of the biggest points to make is that we know that the trans community is small. We do know, based on polls, that more people have become more and more comfortable with coming out as LGBTQ, which is a broad umbrella, not just trans people. But despite that, just because more people feel more comfortable showing up as their true selves in society does not mean that, like, trans people are trying to turn everybody else trans. I think there's a lot of fear and anxiety with that phrase, gender ideology, that encompasses something like that, some fear of what this idea of trans people are going to try to turn all of us trans. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that trans people have had to undergo an intense level, a journey of self-knowledge and understanding that most people do not have to go through or don't ever go through. And I think there's something, it's kind of like sometimes confidence is something we talk about as a trait in people that we just assume is an attractive trait. And it's true. It can be an attractive trait, but there's a flip side to that where it can also feel threatening. When you are not an confident person, when you're not a confident person and you encounter somebody who is extremely confident and is willing and able to say what they really think and speak persuasively without resorting to immaturity or, straw manning or just attacking someone's character, but actually speaks intelligently and clearly, that can be very threatening depending on the level of confidence that you have. And I think something similar is going on with gender ideology, where this fear of how LGBTQ people broadly, the fear that gay marriage impacts heterosexual marriage, or the fear that trans people existing impacts cisgender people. I think a lot of it has to do with there are a lot of people who just haven't, thought deeply or examined deeply the same types of things that trans and LGBTQ people broadly have. And I think that is scary. I don't think that it means that everybody is secretly LGBTQ or like that the people who are most vocal are secretly gay. I just think that it means that there is a much broader world than just this binary of only man and only woman. And honestly, even if you don't affirm transgender people themselves, you are denying science if you don't acknowledge that there's more than just men and women, because there are intersex identities. Those people do exist. And there's a huge variety of how those conditions present. So it's not as if there's just men, women, and then sometimes people who are born that are somewhere in the middle or somewhere different. That is actually a huge spectrum. And I'm not a scientist, so I can't speak in great detail about that, but you can definitely find the science on that pretty easily. And so, within this environment, we've seen queer and transgender communities across the country facing growing waves of hostility. Many proposed bills, executive actions, laws that have passed are multiplying in both scope and severity, and has been commented on again and again, but an insanely outsized response to the actual numbers of transgender people. And, honestly, a hysterical response, and one that further endangers other people, because, you chip away the rights at one vulnerable community and then it's not going to stop there. Some are explicitly seeking to erase trans people from public life, like the executive orders that deny the recognition of trans identities, including rules demanding passports only be issued according to a person's sex at birth. The situation with the driver's licenses in Kansas. Kansas also has a bathroom ban, so not allowing trans people to go to the bathroom in public or in private facilities, like at a private bar versus a public university. And then dismantling as well, this is key, suicide prevention hotlines for LGBTQ youth. Explain to me how that makes anybody safer or anybody healthier or anything better. The removal of care, the removal of support. Each of these policies and many of these policies are dangerous because they threaten directly the safety, health, and legal recognition of trans people, forcing them into situations that put their lives and well-being at risk. And that's true because transition is not a snap of the fingers where you immediately begin presenting as the gender you are. It is a long process that takes time and can be made worse and longer by the removal of these supports. And so, yeah, the state level restrictions are pretty concerning as well. In Kansas, where they have the bathroom ban and the driver's license removal, it ended up targeting someone who had not actually changed their gender marker at all, but only changed their name. And that's really concerning for a lot of reasons, because there are plenty of people who change their name, and there is a big demographic of people who change their name who are not transgender. Women often change their last name, right? So a very concerning precedent there that will impact not just trans people, but the broader community as well. Then we also have the Supreme Court's decision in Skirmetti, which was a Tennessee-based lawsuit surrounding discriminating against trans people. Specifically, the idea was to remove gender-affirming care for trans youth, which they succeeded in doing by arguing that it's okay to discriminate against trans people because of gender dysphoria. So in other words, it's okay to discriminate against this group on the basis of gender dysphoria, even though this group is the only group that is going to experience that. And the legal precedent there definitely puts healthcare for adults at risk too, because most recently, this past week, I believe it was March 10th or 11th, the Fourth Circuit Court ruled that states can compel trans adults to, quote, appreciate their sex through bans on gender-affirming care. This strategy mirrors this idea of, quote, radical incrementalism, which was outlined by the Heritage Foundation president, Kevin Roberts, who designed a process designed to eventually outlaw care entirely. And he literally said, quote, you outlaw it when discussing care for adults. These policies are obviously dangerous because they systematically deny trans people the basic tools we need to live safely, healthfully, and authentically. And even more alarming, as I mentioned before, trans people in prison are now facing conversion therapy and other forms of coercive medical intervention. These individuals cannot opt out or protect themselves, leaving them uniquely vulnerable to abuse. The danger here is immediate and tangible. Policies and practices that masquerade as care or treatment are directly threatening the mental and physical well-being of people who without institutional safeguards, because those institutional safeguards are being purposefully stripped away. So now I want to turn to the Catholic world and talk about how the U.S. bishops are participating and kind of echoing some of the strategies that are happening in the broader right-wing legal world. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the Religious Liberty Commission that was actually created by this administration and Trump, that actually includes two Catholic bishops, Bishop Robert Barron and Bishop Kevin Rhodes. Now, I've talked, critically about Bishop Barron before, but for those who maybe are coming to this podcast and don't have much of a background on him, I want to give a little bit of a little gentler, maybe a little bit of a nicer overview instead of just going right for the things that are problematic. And so I want to tell you a little bit about him. So for many years, Bishop Barron was widely admired for his intellect, cultural engagement, and commentary within the church. From his early Catholicism series and YouTube videos to his openness to dialogue with non-Catholics, Barron earned a reputation as a thoughtful, media-savvy voice. But in recent years, that image has shifted dramatically. Once a bishop willing to critique systemic injustices and hold all sides accountable, he has increasingly aligned his commentary with one political faction, offering almost no critique of Republican policies, even in areas like immigration enforcement or authoritarian overreach, while framing Democrats and progressive movements as existential threats. One of the earliest examples of this was he went to Trump's State of the Union and praised it and was referring to it as a liturgy of democracy, which concerned me deeply because if a member of church hierarchy cannot tell the difference between liturgy and, the mass versus a political activity, one of these civic duties that we engage in as members of a society, that's really concerning. Those things are not the same and should not be put in the same sentence in that way. And another example of the way that he appears to have become incredibly partisan is he is now writing op-eds for Fox News that essentially, from my view, appear to basically download the talking points from the administration and kind of just regurgitate them with a little bit of Catholic language. Particularly, I'm thinking of his response to the events in Minneapolis, keeping in mind that he is the bishop of a diocese that's, I think, about 2.5 hours away from Minneapolis, and was incredibly, bizarrely, strangely silent in the face of citizens being killed there, and also just overall the violence. His take was very much, both sides are at fault here, which echoes what Trump said after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, and basically running a excuse for the people that are doing the real violence and the real crimes, and even just crimes against human dignity. Like, this is not how people should be treated. And this is not how people should be talking about other people. And yet, in the minds of people like Bishop Barron and some Catholics that follow him, it's the Democrats and the liberals that are the ones who are doing that. And, I will say, there are people that are, left-wing activists who do not necessarily have, decorum, or do not speak nicely, do not behave nicely. So there are people like that. But to say that all Democrats, all liberals, and all people who are interested in having a fair and just society are the problem is obviously they've shifted on the Overton window. And, of course, the Overton window describes how slowly more radical and more authoritarian views become normalized as you tolerate them. And so we have to think really critically about what things we engage with in a allowing way versus what things we just immediately shut down and say, no, I know that this is a problem that will lead to even greater problems if we do not push back right now. So with Barron, what once maybe was a ministry marked by intellectual curiosity, some pastoral sensitivity, and principled independence is now solidly partisan advocacy, leaving many longtime admirers puzzled and concerned about his trajectory. You can easily find examples of this. There have been many people who are basically like, what happened to Bishop Barron? And there's many as well who have been like, he was always bad. But I'm just saying there is a nuanced availability of information there. There are people who really did love him who are like, what the heck is going on? His participation in the Religious Liberty Commission illustrates a troubling alignment between high-profile Catholic leaders and a political agenda that conflates religious freedom with the power to impose specific moral beliefs on society. By framing issues in terms of, quote, a dictatorship of relativism, one of his favorites, and a, quote, culture of self-invention, he presents the legal recognition of diverse identities and the public presence of marginalized groups as attacks on religion itself. This framing is misleading and dangerous. It positions entire communities, particularly LGBTQ people, as threats to religious life, rather than recognizing them as citizens entitled to the same protections the First Amendment guarantees. Religious liberty in this account becomes less about protecting conscience and more about protecting institutional power, which I do think is a big problem with a lot of right-wing Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity, and right-wing Catholicism, MAGA Christianity, MAGA Catholicism, is the detachment from living in the example and the model of Jesus and the adherence to a very rigid authoritarian Jesus is a conquering warlord king who wants to behead anybody who isn't white, which just is so bizarre. But I think, again, with the idea of the baby steps of how you get there it's this, again, detachment from reality of real systems and real people, and then amping up of the things within American culture that are already designed to keep you perpetuated in systems. So what I'm referring to specifically is like this idea of the American dream, the idea that we have to work really hard, the idea that the working class gets mobilized against its own interests by the wealthy power because they're dividing everybody over all these identity issues. That is a story as long as that is a story as old as the history of America, and that's what's so ironic, contradictory, infuriating about the current moment is we have always had many different groups of people, and it has never been in the interest of the average citizen to be at each other's throats. Like there is power that is concentrated in wealth at the top, and that power has a vested interest in keeping everybody else fighting so that they can stay elevated in that way. And so that type of dynamic, I think, is intrinsically connected to these same conversations. It's just people are getting mobilized on one issue, as if that one issue, whether it be trans people, when I was growing up, a lot of it was abortion, getting mobilized on one singular issue like that so that we don't look at things in a dynamic, real way. Very rarely in the real world are moral questions just an either or. Like, it's very rarely the case that there will be one right and one wrong answer. It's typically the case that a moral imagination that is complex is necessary in order to look at and evaluate the true depth and reality of the situations that we face. So continuing again with Barron, his rhetoric also endorses the idea that the freedom to live out one's faith in public allows for resisting laws that protect the rights of others. While religious liberty is fundamentally about shielding individuals from coercion, Barron treats it as a license to challenge public policies that secure healthcare, education, or legal recognition for marginalized people. This is very much in line more so with this idea of a Catholic theocracy, where basically Catholicism becomes the government, which again, I'm thinking about Jesus, and I'm not really imagining him being super cozy with this idea of taking over governments and ruling them. It's a very strange way of approaching uh, of approaching the faith, and I think there are a lot of people. I really do think there are a lot of people involved in different fundamentalist religious groups, whether it be Christian or Catholic, that do not actually would not actually go that far in their own mind. However, because they are in a group that demands pure, unquestioning, total obedience to this rigid idea of what is right or is wrong, it kind of forces them to go along with things that they might not actually agree with if they really sat down to think through the implications. So yeah, this is basically a way of using religious liberty, religious freedom, stretched into something totally new that is about empowering powerful institutions to prioritize their own beliefs rather than the safety, dignity, and well-being of those who are already vulnerable and marginalized, which in my view, it includes the working class. It very much includes the poor. And as the wealth disparity increases and we are increasingly owned by these broligarchs, that just tech bros that just control everything and have all the money and continually scrape off the top of the things that were the excess that was supposed to be there to protect us, like there's supposed to be a buffer, and that buffer is supposed to be our healthcare and things like that. But when you've got somebody who can just come along and scrape that off and pocket it, suddenly we are in a more and more precarious position. So Barron's participation in this commission, the Religious Liberty Commission, led by partisan actors and public figures with a clear agenda, underscores another concern: the politicization of Catholic teaching. By lending his moral authority to this group that includes individuals advocating for restrictions on healthcare, education, and LGBTQ rights, and it must be said, he is part of a group that is doing that directly with the U.S. bishops and the USCCB, Barron implicitly signals that the church supports policies that actively harm minority communities. This is a profound misapplication of religious liberty. Instead of standing as a protective force for all conscience rights, Barron's involvement reinforces the idea that religious freedom is conditional, granted only when it aligns with dominant social or political power structures. And you hear that a lot in the white supremacy language and the language coming out now about our heritage and our homeland and our it's all white supremacy, right? It's just this idea that Western culture is superior, all that stuff. It's all wrapped up in there, and that is what is ultimately being prioritized by these ways of thinking, even if it's not necessarily stated by any individual. You have to look at how people fit into the on-ramps, essentially. I mean, this is the whole argument about Joe Rogan as well, where he presents himself as kind of just clueless, roided out muscle guy, but actively has allowed, enabled, encouraged, promoted a lot of dangerous beliefs and outcomes because of the way because of what he platformed. And so that's why it's really important for everyone to think critically about what systems they are in and where do you stand in the chain link, like if you're just kind of floating and you're not thinking of yourself as part of things, if you feel apolitical and removed, it's not actually true. You are part of some system, but your failure and your inability to recognize or acknowledge that is going to end up leading you somewhere you might not want to go or you might not actually agree with. So it's really worth spending some time thinking about this. So now I'll move into the actual annual report on religious liberty issued by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, which was on February 17th. I believe the report is called The State of Religious Liberty in the United States. So, there's different things covered here, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to really focus on one section and one theme that stands out for its aggressive focus, and that is, quote, further repudiation of gender ideology. So the bishops are really fixated on this and on transgender people, and the framing is really troubling. So far from engaging these issues pastorally, the language employed throughout positions real people, real transgender people, as actual threats, turning our lives into ideological fodder for a cultural battle, which is another huge part of the whole thing is the framing around the culture war. I think that's another entry point that's being used. When I was growing up, it was like, you're not allowed to listen to secular music because it's bad or it's dangerous or it promotes XYZ. Like, just a really, really, really stripping away of just the reality of a pluralistic society, of the reality of living with other people, and this idea that we need to fight and defend, and so much emphasis on this idea of apologetics, of like convincing people of things, rather than, I don't know, how do we model again what Jesus would model? I always feel repetitive or basic when I talk about that, and people are truly pretty dismissive of that, because I've seen the way I'm a transgender person on the internet. I have seen how people talk to me, and it is not the way that Jesus would, and I am not combative or rude, and they come out the gate with some pretty terrible stuff. Like one time I wrote a post on Substack, and I got 2 comments that the person then deleted, but I still got the email, so I saw the comments. First one was a long detailed, like point by point, basically like a philosophy bro style. Like he was trying to take my argument apart poorly. Okay, it was poorly, but he deleted it and then wrote another comment that said, "Never mind, you're a demon." And then and that was his explanation for why he deleted his comments, because like he realized that I was transgender after looking more into, like, after writing this long screed, he realized I was trans, and then he was like, "Oh, never mind, you're a demon." So I understand how people speak to trans people online, and it is not great. So this positioning is really a big deal, and especially coming from an authoritative group within the Catholic Church, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and especially because in many ways, from the pastoral angle, it flies in the face of what the model of Pope Francis was. And, Pope Leo, he hasn't had a chance to personally meet with trans people yet. I believe that he will at some point, but Pope Francis did, and I was one of them. And I shook his hand and I said in Spanish that I'm a transgender man, and he didn't freak out. He didn't react like he didn't whip his hand away like that Substack commenter, like, "You're a demon." He was there with me. He smiled. He made direct eye contact. He was present. He modeled how Jesus would be. I know he wasn't perfect, in his pontificate as it relates to trans people or LGBTQ people, but he was making an effort, and that made a huge difference. The making of an effort. It reminds me of when I began my transition, and something that came up a lot. So, I was about 27 or 28 when I started, which means I had many, many years of living as a certain way, And so for people who had known me for a really long time, that's going to mean having to adjust and to come to practice using a new name, using new pronouns and stuff like that. And I have been very blessed that many people, including my really big extended family, they took the time to practice that. They practiced amongst themselves. So then when I, came to events like, Christmas celebrations, things like that, they were prepared. They had practice and they could refer to me appropriately. But here's the thing, when this was happening, one of the responses from my dad was, "You can't expect us to be perfect." And I feel I feel sad that he felt that he had to say it that way, because I was never expecting perfection. I was expecting the effort, because I know that that is a really big change to make after many, many years. Over 2 decades of time thinking about someone in a particular way. So I was not asking for, you're just immediately perfect at doing this. I was asking for the effort. And so I got on a huge rabbit trail there, but this is just some examples of like why it's so important to make those efforts, because those small things, and by make those efforts, what I really mean is making an effort to encounter somebody in the human dignity that they have. This fundamentalist perspective, this idea of trying to think of religious liberty from the dominant perspective of the powerful and then impose it on everybody else is just not only just wrong, but it fails to respect the reality, the diverse reality of the human family that, in my view, has to be intentional from God. Like, God had the opportunity to create only cisgender people. This beautiful articulation in the Theology of the Body by Pope John Paul II, where it's like this beautiful idea that everybody is just given this identity at birth, and that identity says all these poetic, beautiful things about them. Okay, but like that's not what God did. God didn't just make male and female, even though that's what it says in the Bible. At the time that the Bible was written, they didn't know about intersex people. So, there are many things. My point is that we understand more about, that we are no longer literal about. The stars in the sky, and whether or not the earth is flat or it's a globe. You understand where I'm going with this. I don't need to belabor this point anymore. It's just really important that we continue to affirm the dignity of all people and allow people to be who they are without imposing these rigid authoritarian views. It's like Pope Francis. Also, another Pope Francis thing was his understanding of the importance of civil marriage for LGBTQ people, for gay people. He really understood. He understood the difference between the civic world, the civic life, and the church. And yes, I, along with many LGBTQ people, would like there to be full inclusion and affirmation within the church, and do believe that it is possible, because again, we've changed on many things throughout the history of the church. It's not a monolith like the fundamentalists like to believe that it is or say that it is. But yeah, it's steps forward, and that distinction between civic and religious life is really missing, and it is really clear that the USCCB, many American bishops, are not understanding this distinction. So, as mentioned a little bit earlier, we've seen civic courts, already making decisions that are trying to exclude and legitimize some of these ideas about denying trans adults essential care. The bishops also, in November of 2025, prior to this report coming out, they voted to remove gender affirming care from all U.S. Catholic hospitals, which is I think it's 1 in 6 Americans receive healthcare from Catholic hospitals. So that there's not that many Catholics. Like there's more people going to Catholic hospitals than there are Catholics. So it's pretty discriminatory to take away this opportunity for healthcare when the whole point of running these hospitals was to provide for people who aren't even necessarily Catholic. You know what I mean? And then as far as this report goes, one of the most frustrating parts is, again, this repeated use of the term gender ideology, which even Pope Francis did use. And he's interesting because he definitely differentiated between this pastoral welcoming of transgender people and this idea of gender ideology. So if anybody understood what they were talking about, I think it was him. But I think many other people are not actually making a actual academic intellectual distinction here, because I just don't think that because ask people what gender ideology means. Like they're not going to be able to give you something coherent, because here's the truth. They use that term to make it seem like there's an agenda, like the gay agenda. Oh my gosh, y'all, the gay agenda is to survive and to live and to be happy and to be joyful. That's the trans agenda too. That is what it is, to be alive, to live, to survive in a world that is very much focused on crushing and removing us. But if you say there's an ideology, then you have a scary thing to fight against. So yeah, it's presented as a coherent movement, but it is actually a rhetorical catch-all. It is a term specifically that you can dump a bunch of things in, so it has no real singular meaning. It collapses the lived experience of trans people. It collapses different ideas, like different philosophies. It puts Marxism. It puts feminism. Oh my gosh, we got to be terrified of feminism. All these things get dumped into this. And so then it becomes this, it becomes a way to abstract away from, like, what are the material things that trans people face into, okay, now there's this scary ideology and we can create this battle. I wrote an essay about this subject in more depth called Two Errors Catholics Make About Gender. And my argument is that first, when you do this, creating this term of gender ideology, the first problem is that you strip away the humanity, which I just mentioned. And then the second problem is that it requires regret narratives, because if gender ideology is a bad, scary belief system that leads people into terrible things, then you have to have evidence. So you have to have testimonials of people who were in the gender ideology and then got out. And we know from statistics and from evidence that these regret narratives are not the norm of the experience of trans people. The regret rates for transition, the regret rates for trans surgeries are incredibly low. And we also know from that information from those studies that a lot of the time, the detransitioning is motivated by how toxic society is towards trans people. So just sit with that one for a second. I mean, but yeah, that's kind of the whole shtick on gender ideology, which is why it's incredibly frustrating that the bishops continue to kind of beat this dead horse. They continue to bring this up again and again and again, as if this is a central issue and a real thing, and it's not. And I'm not the only one who's talked about this. There's a lot of other great writing. Dan Horan wrote an excellent column for the National Catholic Reporter talking about the straw man of gender ideology, and he is a theologian, so he would be a great one to read for a little bit more information on that. But yeah, they also in this report, they attack trans athletes, specifically ignoring trans men and saying, it's a threat to women's sports, which that the evidence isn't there to support that either. Because here's the truth. If predatory men want to harm women, they do not need to pretend to be women to do so. Transgender women are human beings are women who are likely to be just as scared as predatory men as cisgender women. So, there's another area that there's been a lot of really good research done. I recommend the book. I just did a review of it for NCR. It's called Fair Game. And it goes into 4 myths about trans athletes and gives you the statistics and the detail and tells a lot of really beautiful stories that I really connected to of trans youth that are just trying to be themselves, just trying to exist and play sports and move their bodies and get all the benefits that come from, the competitive interaction with other people in athletics. So kind of to close out, it's funny that I'm closing with kind of a history, but I want to touch on a little bit of history here. And this is going to be very basic, very overview, but I think it's important stuff to include within this conversation. So like basically the question is, how did this version of religious liberty come to be the one that is kind of dominant? And in my view, part of the rise of fundamentalist Christianity and MAGA Catholicism in the US is explicitly about controlling and shutting down liberation movements that empower the poor and marginalized. And a lot of the liberation movements are intertwined with LGBTQ movements. This idea that human dignity, the preferential option for the poor, these things that are core elements of Catholic social teaching. These things are intertwined and have often been pushed down by the powers that be. So, for much of the church's history, Catholic leaders were skeptical of modern religious liberty. In the 19th century, when liberal democratic states were emerging in Europe, many Catholic authorities feared that separating church and state would weaken the church's influence and allow secular governments to regulate religion. Papal documents from that era often defended the idea that the Catholic faith held a privileged place in society. In other words, religious liberty as we understand it today was not originally a Catholic political priority. That began to change in the 20th century, especially as Catholics found themselves living as minorities in pluralistic democracies. And that's really important too, because we've also seen recently there's all these Christian nationalists and fundamentalists Christians here in the US. They're totally willing to use the Catholics, but they don't like the Catholics. And I think that's something that a lot of MAGA Catholics are going to realize and see, and probably already have with various things that have happened. The turning point came at the Second Vatican Council in 1965 with the Declaration Dignitas Humanae. Humanae? Look at me. I do not know Latin, even though I have been Catholic my whole life and was baptized as an infant. I didn't get the Latin treatment really, but I mean, I was born in the 90s, so I don't know. It was not as much a thing, even though the rigid fundamentalism was still definitely a thing. So this document articulated a new theological foundation for religious liberty, that every human person possesses a dignity that includes the freedom to seek the truth and follow the dictates of conscience without coercion from the state. Interesting. Doesn't really sound like what we're doing now. Importantly, the council did not frame religious liberty primarily as a way for Catholics to maintain social power. Instead, it framed it as a universal right that belongs to every person, regardless of their beliefs. Regardless of their beliefs. Yeah. There's so much to say about this. The emphasis was on protecting individuals and minority communities from being forced by governments or institutions to act against their conscience. In the US, this understanding resonated strongly with Catholic leaders who had long experienced life as a religious minority. For decades, Catholic advocates for religious liberty often defended the rights of many groups, not just Catholics, to practice their beliefs freely. The language of religious liberty was associated with protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that the government did not impose ideological conformity. In that sense, the concept functioned as a shield. It protected religious communities from state coercion while allowing people with different beliefs to share public life. Though I won't devote much time to this here, because this would be an entire other episode itself and could very easily be a book, it is important to note that liberation theology also emerged in Latin America close to the timing of the Second Vatican Council in the 60s and 70s in response to widespread poverty, significantly influenced by a book written by a Peruvian priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, in 1971, called Teológica de la Liberación. I'm trying, okay? I'm a little bit slightly better with Spanish than Latin, but still bad. So critics argued that it merged Christian theology, liberation theology itself, merged Christian theology with Marxist concepts like class conflict, focusing too much on social reform rather than spiritual salvation, which did lead to tension with the Vatican, particularly in the 80s. It also faced, it being liberation theology, faced significant suppression from Protestant fundamentalism, which was used to disrupt the strength of the Catholic liberation movement by fragmenting it, emphasizing individual personal sin and a literal interpretation of Scripture that often lacks the contextual analysis employed by liberationists. Yet, liberation theology's focus on social justice, ecological responsibility, Laudato Si, anyone, and the poor are all elements that were echoed in the papacy of Pope Francis, who even con-celebrated Mass with Gutierrez, that writer of that book, who is widely considered the father of liberation theology. So shifting back to our American focus, in recent years, the meaning of religious liberty in America has shifted in public debate. Increasingly, the term is used to argue that religious individuals or institutions should be exempt from laws that prohibit discrimination, particularly laws protecting LGBTQ people. This also goes into the double standard of various Catholic institutions, like Catholic high schools firing teachers that they found out were gay married, while simultaneously having no problem with divorced people on staff or people who have been divorced civically and remarried, but they were not divorced in the church. It's obvious that it's about targeting LGBTQ people. Instead of focusing on protecting individuals from coercion, religious liberty is sometimes framed as the right to refuse participation in certain social or legal arrangements, such as recognizing same-sex marriages or providing gender-affirming care. This reframing changes the purpose of religious liberty from a protection of conscience into a justification for limiting the rights and legal protections of other groups. So it's being completely turned on its head. That shift is visible in the bishop's report from this February, which presents legal recognition of trans people as a growing threat to religious liberty, despite the fact that, even though trans people experienced more protections than ever in modern times, we are obviously being attacked on all sides. So it's really absurd to make this argument, especially because historically, religious liberty was not meant to function as a tool for denying others equal participation in public life. It was meant to ensure that people of different convictions could live together in a pluralistic society without the state forcing anyone to violate their conscience. Understanding the history is essential because it raises an important question for Catholics today: whether the current use of the term still reflects the reality of human dignity, or whether it has been reshaped into something entirely different. Protecting religious liberty cannot come at the expense of human life and dignity. The Church's witness is measured not by its defenses of abstract principles, but by its care for real people navigating real struggles. To reclaim the integrity of religious freedom, we must center those whose lives are most imperiled, speak with clarity and compassion, and confront the ways that language, policy, and ideology can be turned into instruments of harm. Until that happens, the struggle is not simply about law or theology. It is about whether the church will stand with the vulnerable or leave them to face injustice alone. Thank you for joining me today on Whiplash. As a transgender man, I know firsthand that this is a scary time for our community, but I also believe we can push back against distortions of religious liberty, against fear, and push back that to live out a Catholic faith, fully formed, truly protects the vulnerable. I hope this episode empowers you with information, gives you areas to study more, and encourages you to push back against distortions of religious liberty and our Catholic faith.